That's how long it takes the largest rocket ever built to leave the Earth, touch the edge of space, and come back down. 65 minutes to prove that a machine 10 times the size of anything NASA flew to the moon can survive its own violence, the heat, the shock waves, the sheer physics of ripping a 400-foot stack of steel apart in mid-flight, on purpose, at 3 times the speed of sound. On May 22nd, 2026, that machine flew for the 12th time, and for a few minutes it looked like everything was going to work. Then a booster the size of a 20-story building started to spin. This is the story of Starship Flight 12, the flight that almost broke a program on the verge of the biggest test of its life. And Flight 13, the flight built entirely to answer one question. Did SpaceX actually fix it? To understand why Flight 12 mattered so much, you have to understand what SpaceX was risking by flying it at all. For years, every Starship that launched was what engineers call version 2, a design that had scored real wins, but that SpaceX had already decided to retire. Waiting in the wings was something bigger, version 3 or Block 3, a taller ship, a more powerful booster. New refueling hardware needed for a future where starships top off their tanks in orbit before heading to the moon or Mars. And a new engine generation, Raptor 3, pushing more thrust than any engine SpaceX had flown before. Version 3 was not a small upgrade. It was close to a new rocket wearing a familiar shape. And before Flight 12 ever reached the launch pad, the program had already paid a price for it. The booster originally assigned to this mission, Booster 18, never made it to flight. In November 2025, during a routine pressure test at SpaceX's Massey's test site in Texas, a composite pressure vessel inside one of the booster's chinies failed. The resulting rupture tore open the liquid oxygen tank and damaged fuel plumbing nearby. Booster 18 was scrapped days later. It was a costly reminder, months before launch, that version 3 was still an unproven design, and that lesson would echo through everything that followed. Its replacement, Booster 19, was built, tested, and readied in its place, alongside the upper stage that would fly with it, Ship 39. Together, they represented the first ever flight of the full Block 3 configuration. Both stages, both new, launching for the first time from a brand new second launch pad at Starbase. The stakes went well beyond a single test flight. This is where the bigger picture becomes essential to understanding everything that followed. SpaceX had just completed something unprecedented in the history of the company. A NASDAQ initial public offering on June 12, 2026, raising $75 billion, the largest IPO in United States history, and giving SpaceX an implied market valuation of roughly $1.77 trillion on its very first day of public trading, under the ticker SPCX. In its own IPO filing, SpaceX told investors in plain language that its future depends on our ability to increase our launch cadence and payload capacity, which is dependent on the successful development of Starship at scale. Translation: this rocket isn't a side project. It's the company's next decade, riding on a vehicle that, as of Flight 12, had never reached full orbit, never demonstrated refueling in space, and never landed on the moon. SpaceX has disclosed spending more than $15 billion developing Starship to date, a figure that dwarfs the roughly $400 million it spent developing the Falcon 9 rocket that now dominates global spaceflight. In 2025 alone, the company poured $3 billion into Starship research and development. There's also a deadline hanging over all of it that has nothing to do with stock prices. NASA's Artemis 4 mission, the space agency's plan to put astronauts back on the lunar surface for the first time since Apollo 17, currently targeted for early 2028, requires either SpaceX's Starship or Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander to be flight-proven well before any astronaut climbs aboard. For SpaceX's version of that plan, the path runs through 3 unfinished milestones: Starship reaching full orbit, demonstrating propellant transfer between 2 starships in space, and completing an uncrewed lunar landing, all before a crewed mission is even attempted. NASA's own Inspector General flagged, in a March 2026 report, that none of those 3 milestones had yet been reached, and named that gap as a direct risk to the 2028 timeline. So when Starship Flight 12 lifted off from Starbase at 5:30 p.m. Central Time on May 22nd, 2026, one day later than planned, after a hydraulic issue on the launch tower scrubbed the first attempt, it wasn't just a test of hardware. It was the first real evidence the world would see of whether version 3 could deliver on everything riding on it. The ascent began normally. 33 Raptor 3 engines on Booster 19 pushed the stack skyward. But even in this first phase, the vehicle was already being tested by failure. At around 1 minute and 42 seconds into the flight, the booster lost a single outer ring engine. It was a survivable loss. Starship's engine-out design exists precisely to absorb hits like this, and the ascent continued. Then, at about 2 minutes and 20 seconds, came the moment every Starship flight depends on getting right: separation. SpaceX calls it hot staging, a maneuver where the upper stage ignites its own engines before the booster and ship have physically pulled apart, using that thrust to shove the two halves away from each other. It's a technique borrowed, in concept, from Soviet-era rockets decades ago, but never attempted at anything close to Starship's scale. A vehicle standing nearly 400 feet tall, the largest ever built. NASA's own Marshall Space Flight Center had modeled this exact maneuver in supercomputer simulations, studying how rocket exhaust would spread out in the thin, high-altitude air and wash back over the booster's heat shield in the tight gap between the two stages, an environment researchers themselves described as complex and, at the time, not fully understood. On paper, hot staging on Flight 12's worked. The ship pulled away. The booster began its post-separation flip, turning around to fly itself back toward a landing. But something had already gone wrong, and it was about to get worse. Here's where the story splits into two very different fates, one for each half of the rocket. And to keep it honest, it's worth being precise about what SpaceX's engineers first suspected versus what federal investigators later confirmed. Start with the booster, because its story was the more dramatic one. Booster 19 was supposed to flip cleanly in a single vertical plane, nose over, tail forward, ready to burn its engines back toward a splashdown zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Independent frame-by-frame video analysis, along with SpaceX's own post-flight review, showed that instead of that clean vertical pitch, the booster rolled nearly 90 degrees off axis and did it faster than intended. Making things worse, one of the booster's grid fins, the four steerable wings used to guide it through the atmosphere, appears to have clipped the ship's own engine exhaust during the separation, adding to the disturbance. SpaceX's engineering explanation, released in the days after the flight, traced the root cause back to the separation moment itself. A slight timing difference in how the ship's engines ignited during hot staging threw off the booster's flip by roughly that same 90 degrees. Why does a 90-degree error matter so much? Because Super Heavy's boost backburn depends on all 33 engines relighting in a stable, predictable orientation. Fuel and oxidizer need to settle correctly inside the tanks before the engines can draw on them cleanly. An off-axis, faster-than-planned roll is exactly the kind of motion that can send propellant sloshing unpredictably inside those tanks. And that's precisely what investigators believe happened next. The disturbed propellant likely starved several engines of fuel right as they tried to relight, and by some analyses, one engine may have failed energetically enough to damage its neighbors in the same firing ring. The result, of the 33 engines that were supposed to relight for the boost back burn, only a handful managed to ignite at all, and 5 failed outright. The burn that was meant to last close to a full minute was cut dramatically short. From there, things unraveled quickly. As Booster 19 fell back toward the Gulf of Mexico, it attempted its final landing burn, the last chance to slow itself down before impact. Only one of its engines lit. Instead of the soft, controlled splashdown, SpaceX had planned the same kind of gentle water landing the company had rehearsed as an alternative to risking an unproven vehicle on the launch tower's catch arms. Booster 19 slammed into the Gulf of Mexico at approximately 1,150 kilometers per hour, or roughly 900 miles per hour. That's not a landing. That's closer to what engineers politely call a high-speed water impact. It's worth pausing here on something SpaceX itself was careful to point out afterward, because it matters for understanding just how mostly successful this flight really was. SpaceX never publicly promised a tower catch on Flight 12. A soft Gulf splashdown was the stated goal from the start, specifically because the company didn't want to risk its launch infrastructure on brand new hardware. On the terms SpaceX set for itself, reaching the ocean at all, having survived a real ascent and real separation, was still a data point worth having. But there's a difference between we chose a soft splashdown over a risky catch, and the soft splashdown itself failed, and Flight 12 was the second of those. The booster didn't miss the catch tower by choice. It missed its own gentler backup. Plan 2. Meanwhile, up above, Ship 39 was writing a very different chapter of the same flight. About 40 seconds after separation, roughly 3 minutes into the mission, Ship 39 lost one of its 3 vacuum-optimized Raptor engines, the kind designed to fire efficiently in the near vacuum of space. Onboard cameras caught a bright flash in the engine bay at the moment of failure. But this is where Starship's design showed exactly what it was built to do. The flight computer automatically compensated, burning its 5 remaining engines longer and reorienting its still-firing engines to keep the thrust running straight through the vehicle's center of mass. Second stage engine cutoff arrived later than planned, roughly 9 minutes and 23 seconds into the flight, instead of the intended 8 minutes and 11 seconds. but the ship still reached its intended suborbital trajectory. SpaceX described this outcome as within bounds, a contingency scenario the company had actually modeled and prepared for in advance, rather than a fully clean insertion. From there, Ship 39 delivered a genuine milestone. It deployed all 22 of its Starlink mass simulators, dummy satellites standing in for the real thing, using an improved deployment mechanism nicknamed the PEZ dispenser. 2 of those simulators carried onboard cameras and lights, nicknamed informally by observers as the Dodger Dogs, and beamed back the first ever external views of a ASO starship coasting through space, relayed live through the Starlink network itself. Then, Ship 39 turned for home, or rather for the Indian Ocean. It survived full atmospheric reentry, one of the hardest physics problems in the entire mission, as the vehicle's heat shield tiles absorbed. Temperatures intense enough to melt most metals. It executed its terminal landing flip and burn. 2 of its 3 landing engines lit, not the full set, but enough. Ship 39 reached its planned splashdown zone in the Indian Ocean, tipped over, and broke apart on contact with the water, exactly as previous successful Starship test flights had also ended. So here is Flight 12 in full, a rocket that flew, that separated, that survived engine failures on both halves through genuine redundancy, that deployed its payload, that made it to both intended splashdown zones, and that also lost its booster to a violent, uncontrolled ocean impact. 2 failures, 0 catastrophic losses of the mission's core objectives. SpaceX called it broadly successful. The Federal Aviation Administration called it a mishap requiring a formal investigation. Both of those things are true at the same time. And understanding why is the key to understanding everything Flight 13 exists to answer. Under U.S. federal law, when a space flight causes a mishap, SpaceX's preferred softer word for what most of us would call a crash, the Federal Aviation Administration doesn't let the next rocket fly until it understands why. That's not a suggestion, it's a requirement. And so from May 22nd onward, Starship's entire flight program was grounded, waiting on an investigation into exactly what went wrong aboard Booster 19. That investigation ran for 52 days. In the meantime, SpaceX's own engineers were already publishing early theories. The sequence timing explanation for the flip, the propellant slosh theory for the failed relight. Those were SpaceX's working hypotheses, offered candidly, but hypotheses all the same, pending outside confirmation. On July 13, 2026, the FAA closed the investigation and released its findings. And here's where theory becomes confirmed fact. The agency's final report identified 2 most probable root causes for the loss of Super Heavy booster. 19. First, heat effects on propulsion system components during the ascent phase, meaning parts of the engine system were damaged or degraded by heat. Exposure they weren't built to withstand at that point in flight. And second, erroneous engine alarm system settings, which caused engines to shut themselves down prematurely, misreading conditions that were actually part of normal, if aggressive, multi-engine operation. The FAA confirmed the 2 issues were interconnected. Heat damage compromised the relight attempt, while the misconfigured alarm thresholds caused additional engines to shut down that didn't need to. Importantly, the FAA's official finding is more specific than SpaceX's early public statements, and it shows that some of the popular slosh and roll narrative, while a real and contributing factor in the disturbance, sat alongside, and possibly downstream of, a more fundamental hardware and software problem the company hadn't fully spelled out until the federal report closed the loop. SpaceX proposed 4 corrective actions, all accepted by the FAA. Hardware changes to the propulsion system to address the heat exposure, and software changes to the engine alarm and abort logic, so the system no longer mistakes normal 33-engine flight behavior for a fault requiring shutdown. On the separation side, independent of the FAA's propulsion findings, SpaceX also modified the ship's engine startup sequence during hot staging, specifically to make the booster's directional flip more tolerant of small timing variations, engineering directly targeted at preventing a repeat of that 90-degree error. With the investigation closed on July 13th, the runway, literally and figuratively, was clear for Flight 13. This is where Flight 13 enters the story, and where this documentary has to be precise about tense. As of this recording, Flight 13 has not yet flown. It is scheduled, not completed. SpaceX is targeting a 90-minute launch window opening at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, July 16, 2026, from the same Pad 2 at Starbase, Texas, exactly 52 days after the Flight 12 mishap first grounded the program. The vehicle itself, Booster 20 and Ship 40, the second ever pairing of full version 3 hardware. In the 2 weeks before launch, SpaceX static fired all 33. Raptor 3 engines on Booster 20 for a full duration burn, and separately ignited all 6 Raptor 3 engines on Ship 40. Both tests completing without issue, a signal, though not a guarantee, that the fixes are behaving as engineers hoped on the ground. The mission profile is, deliberately, almost a carbon copy of Flight 12, a 65-minute suborbital flight, the booster once again targeting a splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico rather than a tower catch, the ship again aiming for a controlled descent into the Indian Ocean. SpaceX explicitly designed Flight 13 this way. Not to add new stunts, but to prove the same mission can be completed without the failures that marred it the first time. As SpaceX put it in its own mission materials, Flight 13 will largely attempt an improved outcome of the same mission. There are, however, real firsts built into this flight. For the first time, Starship will carry functional Starlink V3 satellites, 20 of them, rather than the mass simulators flown on Flight 12. These next-generation satellites are physically too large to fit inside a Falcon 9's payload fairing, which is exactly why Starship exists as a vehicle in the first place. Without it, this entire generation of the Starlink network can't reach orbit. If deployment succeeds, the satellites will attempt to extend solar arrays and antennas and link briefly with a ground station in South Africa and with the wider Starlink constellation via laser communication, though because they're riding the same suborbital arc as the ship itself, they'll re-enter the atmosphere and burn up roughly 20 minutes after deployment. It's a brief test, but a real one. 6 of those 20 satellites carry something else. Cameras aimed directly at Ship 40's heat shield. SpaceX has painted several of the ship's protective tiles white, turning them into deliberate imaging targets standing in for missing or damaged tiles. A live in-flight rehearsal for how the company plans to inspect a returning Starship's thermal protection system on future missions, when the goal shifts from, does the ship survive, to, can we quickly tell if it's safe to fly again? And then there's the objective, Flight 12 never got to attempt at all. An in-space relight of one of Ship 40's Raptor engines. On Flight 12, the loss of a vacuum. Engine during ascent forced mission controllers to abandon that test entirely. It remains, in the words of one former SpaceX Vice President of Flight Reliability, probably the last big challenge, standing between Starship and the kind of deep space, refuel and orbit architecture that both Mars missions and NASA's Artemis lunar landings depend on. Prove that one engine can shut down and restart cleanly in the vacuum of space, and the door opens to everything Starship was actually built to do. So, let's put Flight 12 and Flight 13 side by side, stripped down to what's actually changed and what hasn't. What's the same? The vehicle generation. Both flights fly version 3 hardware, the same Raptor 3 engines, the same basic 65-minute suborbital arc, the same 2 splashdown zones half a world apart. SpaceX isn't trying to prove something new here. It's trying to prove the same thing, correctly, twice. What's different is everything the FAA's investigation touched. The booster's engine startup sequence during hot staging has been modified specifically to tolerate timing variability, targeting the exact 90-degree flip error that doomed Booster 19. The propulsion system has hardware changes addressing the heat exposure the FAA identified. The engine alarm and abort software has been rewritten so it no longer misreads normal multi-engine flight stress as a failure, demanding shutdown. And the payload has gone from simulated to real. 20 functional satellites replacing 22 dummies, with a live heat shield inspection experiment riding along for the first time. What's new in ambition? The in-space Raptor relight attempt that Flight 12 never got to try. Whether all of that is enough is a question this documentary cannot answer for you, because as of right now, nobody can. That's not a cop-out, it's the honest state of the story. Flight 13 sits on the launch pad as a hypothesis with a deadline. July 16th, 2026, 6:45 p.m. Eastern. Everything SpaceX diagnosed, every fix the FAA accepted, every hour of static fire testing on Booster 20 and Ship 40, all of it gets tested against real physics in a single afternoon. And the stakes attached to that afternoon are larger than one test flight, in ways that are worth sitting with. Gwynne Shotwell, SpaceX's president, has stated the company's target is roughly 1 Starship launch per month, working toward full orbital flight, not just suborbital, potentially as soon as the next mission after this one. SpaceX's own numbers suggest why cadence matters so much. Falcon 9 already launches cargo to orbit at around $2,120 per kilogram, an industry-leading figure achieved through years of booster reuse. Starship's target is under $100 per kilogram, a roughly 27-fold reduction, but that number only holds true if each ship can fly 70 or more times with minimal work between flights. Neither assumption has been proven at any real scale yet. SpaceX posted a $4.9 billion loss in 2025, built substantially around Starship's development costs. Then there's the human side of the timeline. NASA's Artemis Y4 mission is aiming for humanity's first crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17 in early 2028, and it cannot happen at all until Starship, or a competing lander first reaches orbit, then proves it can transfer propellant between two vehicles in space, then lands on the moon with nobody aboard. Every one of those milestones is still ahead. The relight attempt plan for Flight 13 isn't a side experiment. It's a small, deliberate step down that exact road. And in the financial world, watching all of this unfold, SpaceX's newly public stock has already felt the weight of that uncertainty, trading roughly 30% below its post-IPO high in the weeks since its record-breaking NASDAQ debut, hovering close to its original offering price as investors wait to see whether Flight 13 restores confidence or deepens the doubt. Here is what makes this story genuinely gripping, without needing a single word of exaggeration. This isn't a tale of simple failure followed by simple triumph. It's messier and more human than that. Flight 12 was, at the very same time, a vehicle that survived two separate engine failures through pure engineering redundancy, deployed its payload successfully, reached both its intended splashdown zones, and also violently destroyed its own booster on impact with the ocean. Both of those facts are true. Spaceflight, at this level of ambition, rarely offers a clean verdict. It offers data, sometimes beautiful, sometimes brutal, and asks engineers to come back and try again. That's exactly what Flight 13 is. Not a victory lap, not a guaranteed do-over, but the next honest attempt at answering a question that only real flight, not simulation, not static fire, not confident press releases, can actually settle. 65 minutes, a rocket the size of a skyscraper, 20 real satellites depending on it working, a lunar landing timeline depending on what it proves. Next. And a question that will only be answered the moment the engines light on Thursday, July 16th, 2026. Whether the fixes made in 52 days on the ground can survive the physics of the sky. The story of Flight 12 is finished. It's written, closed, and filed with a federal agency. The story of Flight 13 hasn't happened yet, and that's exactly why it's worth watching.